promised third video on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Or I guess it's the fourth video, but the third of the course discussion. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a classic slasher. In fact, it helped invent the slasher genre. It's from 1974, directed by Tobe Hooper. The film was made on a shoestring budget, even for the time. Hooper was primarily a documentarian and professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and he was able to glom together some funding to make this horror film. It was produced with about $140,000. That would be probably with inflation about $700,000. And even though that sounds like quite a bit of money, it's extraordinarily small for the production of a movie. And upon its release, it made $30 million. So it was a huge box office success and took a lot of people by surprise. When Hooper made this film, he only hired actors from the Austin area. The film was made in the countryside around Austin in the desert, and the all of the major actors were had some experience, but primarily just in acting in plays in the community, and they had other jobs. In fact, a few of them had been war veterans and had come back from the Vietnam War, which was still raging at the time of this. When they made this film, it was in the heat of summer, and they had to shoot for 16-hour days, 7 days a week. And they were afraid that they would lose some of the outfits for it. So the actress who played Sally had to wear the same outfit for pretty much the whole production time, and by the end of the shooting, her clothes were so drenched in blood that they became stiff. So it really gives you a sense of how much this was done by the seat of its pants. And this is an important thing to keep in mind, again, while you're watching this movie. Because undoubtedly, as you were watching this, you hopefully got a digitally remastered version, but if not, you watched the original production values, and it's pretty bad when it comes to the kind of the movie viewing experience that you're used to. The sound was terrible. It doesn't seem to be synced correctly. And again, this is part of its low budget, and really is somewhat of a surprise that it became such a big hit. But it opened up the whole slasher genre. You've already gone over our discussion of the slasher, and our goal with this movie is to potentially look through some scenes and see how they simultaneously represent the discussions of the slasher that we had in the last video, as well as in some framing devices for audience. Okay, because this movie does try to bring the audience by suggesting that this is based on real life events, and in fact, it is. A key thing that we've mentioned in passing is that a few classes ago is that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Psycho, and Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs are all based on a very famous serial killer by the name of Ed Gein, or Gain. He's from rural Wisconsin, and from 1954 to 1957, he ostensibly killed about 15 women. One of the things that he used to do that's kind of, would put this out there, and is certainly kind of, you see at the beginning of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, is he initially engaged in grave robbing. What kind of corpses did Ed Gein steal? Well, it's best to know a little bit about his background. He came from a rural family. His mother was extremely religious, and she didn't like the man with whom she was married, who was an alcoholic. And she consistently bestowed on her two boys that women were somehow evil, particularly loose women. And so this was something where she kept him away from women and created a lifelong fantasy with them. At the same time, she dies somewhat young, and Gain would later, when he was going to find uh, bodies to grave rob, this is how he started out. He actually would go to various graves and desecrate the bodies, dig them up, and then take trophies. And these women were all roughly the same age as his mother when she died. So you kind of get a sense now where Hitchcock is getting, and the screenplay writer for Psycho, were getting their ideas for the mother Norman Bates relationship in the movie Psycho. Um, the other thing that he used to do, both his grave robbing, but also when he was, and now we've seen a few grave robbing scenes between Frankenstein and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, is that he used these body parts to fashion homemade items. And so when they actually discovered that Ed Gein was killing all these people and went to his home, they found bowls made out of human skulls, and then they found lampshades made out of uh, human skin and chair upholstery. And one of the things they also found was a body hanging from a meat hook that had been disemboweled and was headless, and he was using the various parts from that. I've started, this whole time I've been speaking, you've been staring at this gruesome image from the dinner scene of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And I'm not sure if you noticed while watching the movie, but the lampshade that is hanging from above over the dinner table, the chandelier, as it were, is a human face. And uh, we are currently in the view of Sally, who has been fed some sausage, which now that we've become familiar between with the movie and some of the things that this family has done, the Sawyer family, we get a sense that they're making all of this material out of the food. And so ironically, I'm sorry, out of the people. And the people that have been, taken before our five young teenagers find themselves in this situation. And so when we've seen them earlier, because we start to learn that the man who owned the Drayton, who owned the gasoline station, who had the great barbecue, and is also the cook, has already fed our five young people some likely some human body parts. A fact that if you haven't picked up, now you have, I hope, and added another layer of horror to this because they had been engaging in the cannibalism that they, without realizing it, that they themselves would also be, subsequently a product of. So, um, a last point that I want to make about Ed Gein is he also used to skin the women that he killed, and he would make suits out of them. And this is, of course, the inspiration for Buffalo Bill. While looking at this movie, and before we move to the scenes, you've undoubtedly been kind of introduced to these grotesque characters, the Sawyer family, the hitchhiker, the cook, Leatherface, and then Grandpa. You see him sitting there, and you see body parts strewn all over the table. You see him in the background, and you obviously have them eating it. And I just want to remind you of, before we move on, because unfortunately I could not find a good clip of this scene, which is a terrifying, terrifying scene. Um, but is utterly a horrific scene when you in fact you have a close up on Sally and her blue eyes and her just screaming and the terror of the reality of the situation she's in. And then later on, a few minutes after this terror and this scream, we find ourselves in Sally's perspective, much like the shot I've brought you to here, where we're looking at all these people. And this is, as you remember, one of the, when we've been watching slashers, we've been exposed to the idea of how we frequently inhabit the position of the killer. In this instance, we are put into the position of the victim, and like her, we're with a fixed camera, this fixed shot, utterly stuck in this macabre situation and having to kind of take it all in. And again, going back to our discussion of slashers from last time, there was the distinction, various ways in which the viewer identifies with the killer and occupies different positions. This is a kind of topic we've been talking about all, the past few weeks. And in this instance, being in the position of the victim is almost a masochistic position, a position where we're supposed to feel a little bit on edge. So I'm going to take a break from this image and set up a few clips, and I'll be right back in just a sec. Okay, welcome back. I'm about to show you a clip from the beginning of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and this is kind of setting the stage for a horrible situation that has happened, as well as giving us enough background on why we find these 5 young people in this situation. The movie begins with a warning and then a kind of very interesting way of filming the desiccated body parts, and we have no real sense of what we're witnessing. And as this scene unfolds, just beginning the movie, we're put in a position of non-knowledge, a position where we don't really understand what is happening. And as the scene unfolds, we learn that, and then we become introduced to the five young people. We are also being shown why they find themselves here, because the Hardesties, Sally and Franklin, are brother and sister, and their family used to own property here, and their grandfather used to come and take his cattle to the local slaughterhouse, and from there was able to make money. And eventually, they left the area. And while keeping this in the back of your mind, the kids seem to come from a distinctly different social class than many of the locals, and so they find themselves going to see if, in fact, their relative's body has been desecrated. And it's interesting. It's suggested that it is, but it's never really explicitly stated. And we find them at this kind of almost carnivalesque place where there are a bunch of police and then a bunch of drunks just kind of hanging out, and that kind of unsettling discussion by that one man who says there's a lot more going on here than is before the eyes. All of this is kind of really hitting us over the head in a heavy-handed way about what is about to, what could be forthcoming. But nevertheless, we aren't really paying attention because we're new to the film. And then these little clues are, the way in which the film is constantly commenting on itself. Well, we discussed that last time as an example of what is frequently called a postmodern slasher. What we can take from this and why this film is enduring despite the low production quality is that it's very smartly done in terms of being a very tight movie. When Hooper made this movie, he didn't have a lot of experience behind his belt, under his belt when making this. And it didn't lead necessarily to this great career. I should have mentioned in the last, section, none of these actors really went on to anything. Even though the movie did make money, it wasn't something that all of them started living lavish lifestyles and relocating to Hollywood. In fact, most of them lived until their death in the Austin area, which is Austin is the capital of Texas, and it's a college town where the University of Texas at Austin is located. And um, Hooper did not, he did a couple more horror films, including the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, as well as Poltergeist, although there is some speculation that Spielberg might have used Hooper as in many ways um, the face of this because he was under contract to do E.T. And so there's just quite a bit of speculation about it. But if you've ever seen Poltergeist, it's a pretty good horror film too, but with much higher production values. And Hooper really struggled with money throughout his career. Basically he made a series of horror films, but even the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, which is now a cult classic, people didn't really know what to do with it. It was, not as, straightforwardly a horror film, but more of in Hooper's own mind, a black comedy. Um, but as I'll show you in the the forthcoming weeks, it has some pretty ridiculous scenes and is, making all kinds of secondary references in it, and is yet again another example of how Hooper is making films that are a lot more complex than potentially your fairly typical horror film. So I've talked a lot right now. Let me show this clip, and I'll come back, and then we'll move more quickly with a few others. All right. So this is from. Excuse me.
The film which you are about to see is an account of the tragedy which befell a group of 5 youths, in particular Sally Hardesty and her invalid brother Franklin. It is all the more tragic in that they were young. But had they lived very, very long lives, they could not have expected, nor would they have wished to see as much of the mad and macabre as they were to see that day. For them, an idyllic summer afternoon drive became a nightmare. The events of that day were to lead to the discovery of one of the most bizarre crimes in the annals of American history, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Is only one of a series to be handed down as a result of a special grand jury investigation. Grave robbing in Texas is this hour's top news story. An informant led officers of the Muerto County Sheriff's Department to a cemetery just outside the small rural Texas community of Newt early this morning. Officers there discovered what appeared to be a grisly work of art, the remains of a badly decomposed body wired to a large monument. A second body was found in a ditch near the perimeter of the cemetery. Subsequent investigation has revealed at least a dozen empty crypts, and it's feared more will turn up as the probe continues. Deputies report that in some instances, only parts of a corpse had been removed. The head, or in some cases, the extremities removed, the remainder of the corpse left intact. Evidence indicates the robberies have occurred over a period of time. Sheriff Jesus Maldonado refused to give details in the ghoulish case and said only that he did have strong evidence linking the crime to elements outside the state. Area residents have reportedly converged on the cemetery, fearing the remains of relatives have been removed. No suspects are in custody as the investigation at the scene continues. Oil storage units continue to burn out of control at the huge Texaco refinery near the Texas-Louisiana border.
Okay, we are just gone through that clip, and we're not really sure exactly what we have seen, but it is suggested that the viewpoint that we've had for all those photographs at the beginning are of the person who actually dug up the bodies and positioned them in that regard. And so there's, as we learn over the course of the movie, that person is likely the hitchhiker. I mean, much is, of course, left to the imagination, but the hitchhiker that we'll be looking at in just a second is, in fact, the one who was photographing the bodies and kind of turning them into objects of art. And that's an ongoing theme of this entire movie, the way in which the body has terrible violence done to it. And this is something that Hutchins doesn't bring up so much in the slasher, but the use of power tools in horror films and to dismember the body, to kind of make the insides come out, that is something that is new to the horror, to the slasher. And the Texas Chainsaw Massacre really did make use of that. We also, will notice there's an extensive use of gore and blood, and the blood this film was done on such a low budget that the blood they actually did use for this movie, according to some sources, was blood from a local slaughterhouse that they found. So the thing to keep in mind is that this movie, because it was made on a low budget, is constantly trying to blur the boundary between life and art. And we saw that at the beginning with the warning. I mean, the very fact that the director is specifically trying to get the audience to draw on historical reality or something that they may know. And the Ed Gain story would have been so shocking to most people, because it was, this is the beginning of television, and mass viewing audiences. And so this name, Ed Gain, who may have just been kind of lost to kind of rural Wisconsin folklore, does become a national celebrity. And it's that anxiety that Hooper is trying to dig into. The other thing you should know about Hooper is that he actually thought that one of the primary modes for coming up with this horror genre, the slasher, and all this terrible stuff, was the Vietnam War. Hooper actually said that one of his inspirations for coming up with this was the nightly newsreels featuring kind of bodies being butchered or brains being shown, because the Vietnam War was the first kind of television war, and it would be reported home every night, and sometimes the imagery would be quite grisly. And for him, this was kind of a real statement on humans being these horrible, horrible entities. And therefore, it wasn't a big stretch for him to go from, this news footage from the Vietnam War and the horrible violence of the Vietnam War, which, would result in the death of over 58,000 Americans and well over 3 million Vietnamese over the course of its fighting, even though it was never formally declared a war, interestingly enough. And so that is just another example of how our horror films are frequently drawing from life and trying to get us to look at the horror of and violence of everyday life that we push aside. And so this is an extreme version in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But a war is, as you know, going back to our first class, is of course the ultimate horror movie that some of us have had to live through. In any event, I'm going to stop right now and prepare the next clip. The next clip we're going to look at is from the hitchhiker. And the hitchhiker is, as I was mentioning earlier, is likely the person that took these shots of the bodies as he was putting them into this particular pose. The way that Hooper also shot this scene, though, also leaves us to wonder if it was like a crime scene. It's also very enigmatic, but the very fact that we then go to seeing the posed images before we've been totally in the dark, and then we finally get the view and the camera moving out to show us these posed bodies, and then we actually fade to black, and that this is where you have the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This is what's being shown, and then the actors are kind of the credits are all listed. And then what does Hooper do? He then plays the radio and talks about some horrific events. I mean, this is again going back to how he's trying to connect fiction and reality. And the hitchhiker scene really does bring that forward for us, because at this moment in time, and probably probably just a little bit after, hitchhiking was pretty common. People actually trusted each other and didn't think twice about picking up somebody on the road in need. But perhaps because of movies like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, picking up hitchhikers is no longer a practice, except in very small instances. So I leave that parting thought. I'm going to cue up the hitchhiker scene. And just kind of want to prepare you and warn you that this hitchhiker scene is not very good, because I could not find the clip. So it has a surprise ending that actually isn't in the movie. But just 1 second. Okay, welcome back. We are queued up to the hitchhiker scene. Just a little context. We've been, we've had the beginning scene. We've had the kids going to the cemetery and finding out about their whether it is a family relative. We've had the very curious scene where we've been introduced to Franklin, Sally, Jerry, Pam, and Kirk. We're going to learn in a little bit that Pam and Kirk are kind of a couple. Potentially Sally and Jerry are supposed to be potentially coupling. And then there is Franklin, who is in a wheelchair. One of the curious things about this movie is its portrayal of this person with a handicap. He is not a sympathetic character, but nevertheless, he's a fascinating character. And in fact, you see him having, some connection to the hitchhiker, both in this scene that we're going to watch in its abbreviated form, but also by the way he plays with his knife, like the hitchhiker did thereafter. He is, given our group here, the other relative to the two couples, and we'll see he later will try to have a conversation with Sally and be, like, you didn't really want me to come along. And the actor who played this character really made him pretty unsympathetic. He was actually somebody who, worked had a day job and was doing night theater as a secondary one, and managed to just land this role. And he didn't do a ton of acting after this, and in fact went back to his day job. But there's the scene when he falls out of the wheelchair and rolls down the hill when the big truck goes by. And, the truck does represent a kind of technological symbolism of, the ways in which human beings are small in comparison to something like a big truck. And it also is to emphasize the frailty of Franklin. He doesn't become a hero in this movie, as we know. And he is a kind of self-pitying figure throughout this, and a somewhat pathetic figure. And this is, all taking place before there is even a recognition of people with disabilities. The American with Disabilities Act hasn't even been passed at this moment in time. So a lot of the people who have disabilities are portrayed not, as others because they were othered within society. They were really treated as somehow less than human. A key a key point then is that they go by right before this scene. They go by a slaughterhouse, and if you've never been nearby a slaughterhouse, you just have to kind of use your imagination. You and your imagination should immediately suggest that the smell would be horrific, as you know from the scene, because they are just systematically killing animals in order to produce meat for you. And so that, it does raise the very issue. Here they are driving on a highway, going by a slaughterhouse, being kind of inundated by this smell. And right before they pick up the hitchhiker, you have Franklin talking about the killing of the animals because he remembered doing it with his relative and going in there. And before, the animals would be killed by a human being, but later they would be killed with a gun, basically a metal rod would be jettisoned into their brain and kill them instantly. For those of you who have ever seen No Country for Old Men, that is in fact what the killer uses in that movie to kill all the characters. That is what would what fells the cattle. And it's very systematic and technological, and it kind of leaves the human element of having to kill done to the machine, and it just is like an assembly line of death because that's what slaughterhouses are. You take an animal, it comes in, and it's immediately killed and then chopped up, and a lot of this is done by the machinery, right? Although slaughterhouses are one of the few places where you do still have quite a few laborers still involved. And this is so that people can eat meat. Now, one thing you should know is a lot of the people after making this film all became vegetarians because it does draw attention to the fact of the materiality of meat. When you're eating a cow or a hamburger, you really don't think twice about it, but the violence that has happened to give you that hamburger kind of gets left off the page, as it were, just so you go into the supermarket and just see that. See something that you buy that's in a nice white, in nice bright white wrapping, suggesting kind of simultaneously health and a very an anesthetic environment that removes all violence. And the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is in fact commenting on this violence, as I suggested. And right before the hitchhiker is picked up, they've gone by it. When they get the hitchhiker, they're assuming he actually worked at the slaughterhouse. And Franklin has been discussing how the process of killing, and it was, very, as I mentioned, very systematic and very, very awful. And the other people in the van don't even really want to hear it. And it kind of shows you this connection that will eventually develop between Franklin and the hitchhiker. Because they are both, going back to our larger discussions, kind of other within this whole scene. Because one of the things you may notice is that all the people who are in the movie are relatively attractive white people, and then you have the hitchhiker, and then you have Franklin, who don't fulfill kind of your standard modes of beauty. And this was done very, very openly. So let's watch the hitchhiker scene. Again, I'm going to warn you that this has been partially edited, and it ends with a music video that's just going to throw you for a loop, which we can laugh about. But I'll talk to you on the other end of it.
We pick him up? Oh, yeah, man. Pick him up.
Well, I think we just picked up Dracula.
Where you headed, man?
South. You work at that place? Oh, no.
How did you get stuck way out here?
I was at the slaughterhouse.
The old way. With a sledge. See, that was better. They died better that way.
How come? I thought the gun was better.
Oh, no. With the new way, people put out a job. I was the killer.
Damn.
Let me see him.
They don't send the heads away.
You took these, huh?
Yeah.
Franklin. What are you doing?
Hey, man, put that knife up. Oh, come on.
What are you doing to yourself? Oh my
You took my picture. Hey, man, what happened? What are you
Okay, so we've just watched this scene in its abbreviated form. This is where Franklin and has asked the hitchhiker about what's the better way to kill the animals, and the hitchhiker has mentioned that when they replaced the people at the slaughterhouse with the machines, they put all of them out of work, and this is a kind of cue into the idea that one of the reasons why the Sawyer family, of which the hitchhiker is part, are engaging in this consumption of people is because they have no other way of making money, because it's not like there's a ton of jobs nearby. And so this technological transformation has um, altered their reality, and they've had to come up with other ways of maintaining their survival and still have meat to eat. All right. And so this is, where we get a sense of a correspondence between people having jobs so that they can buy meat and buy, food to feed their family, and what the Sawyers have had to do. We've also had this interesting moment where, he brings up the hitchhiker brings out the camera, which kind of indicates that this may be the same, looks like the same camera from the opening sequence of the movie. And he sits there and kind of suggests that he's going to take a picture while they all look on somewhat horrifically. This is another instance of technology kind of mediating human relations. I know nowadays with smartphones, this is not a big deal, but the camera and the camera eye is literally a technological extension of the human being that is there. And if you recall, the hitchhiker is sitting there kind of looking at them all and kind of suggesting he's going to take a photo of one or the other. And he's kind of moving around, almost targeting them. And that's where there's this great uncertainty. Just a key point you should know is that there was an essay that had come out not too long before this about how how photography was in fact a way of stealing people's souls, because it was a technological. This was written by Susan Sontag, and it was a technological way of seizing people's souls. And this is played out in this scene by the fact that they're all not sure what's going to happen, and then he takes the picture and then he demands money. It got cut out in what the clip that you saw, but he demands money, and then when they don't offer him the money, he burns it, which they find also offensive, because it's basically, two things are happening here. He needs money, so he's taken this photo and he's provided this service and then demanded it, and they can't believe that because they're giving him a ride. But they also, feel like something's been violated by the fact that he's taking that some aspect of their lives has been violated by him taking that photo and then burning it, and that's when they have him get out. The other kind of obviously very disturbing thing in this moment is when he takes in this scene is when he takes the knife from Franklin, who's been kind of picking his dirt out of his nails, and grabs it and cuts himself. And while watching this, we've all been wondering, what's on his face, and pretty, is it blood? Is it a birthmark? It's all very uncertain. And then he cuts himself and is just sitting there bleeding. And before leaving, he marks Franklin with the cut, and but he still leaves the knife, and Franklin will play with it a little bit later on. Uh, and another key point to keep in mind is he is marking the van by he takes his cut and he wipes blood on it, and so it is in some ways something where he does acknowledge who they all are and is marking them, and if they need to stay around, he will, there's in some way a marker of that. And so they go not too long after this to get some gas where they'll meet his brother, the cook, and he'll say he has no gas and that the gas will be coming the next day. And then he'll be offering them some barbecue, which they'll be eating, not knowing that they're actually eating people at this point. And this is another grotesque scene, but we have a couple of, themes that are played out in this scene and the scene I just described of a conflict between the country and the city. The kids all have a certain amount of affluence. They kind of demonstrate that they come from money by the sheer fact that they can, either own or have a camper van that they can take around and go visit places. So that suggests that they have some money. The fact that they don't have to be working and can be doing this, again, indicates that they have money. And meanwhile, the people living in the countryside don't even have a means to get food because all the jobs have dried up. And so this was also a comment on American society in the 1970s, where a lot of the industries and the factories were closing up. So I know this is, this may seem like, no, you're just reading into this, but this is one of the reasons why this movie is so enduring despite the low production values, because it seems to be touching on so many different issues. Okay, we'll take a little break and I'll set up the next clip. Okay, so we have found ourselves now after the hitchhiker scene. We have found them going. They go to the gas station and they find out they don't have the gas, so they decide to go visit the old Hardesty house, and come back either later that day or the next morning for some gasoline. While they're doing, while they're at the Hardesty house, we have, Franklin unable to be taken up the stairs, and we have everybody kind of exploring. And it's during this time that Kirk and Pam decide that they're going to go to a swimming hole because it's really, really hot, and they figure it's the 1970s and this is still a kind of a free love moment, and so they're gonna go to the water and try and cool down after Franklin had mentioned that there was a good watering hole. While this is happening, they end up kind of going to the property next door and seeing lots of abandoned cars and trucks and so forth, not really thinking twice about it. And it's interesting because Kirk, still feels entitled enough to go ahead and walk into the house. All right, this is this is an interesting moment where, Kirk is showing a kind of social class. And again, going back to what I was saying last time, that these are entitled people. They're used to kind of having the world set up for them. So he's like, oh, maybe I can borrow some gas from them because they hear a generator going, and I'll give them, my guitar for collateral. And he goes up to the place, and when he doesn't get, when he knocks on the door and nobody comes, He nevertheless goes ahead and opens the door and walks in. And we know soon thereafter that Leatherface kills him. Uh, in the meantime, Sally has been. Hi, so Pam has just walked in to the house, and upon, when she doesn't hear from Kirk, and she has gone and stumbled over a bucket into a room filled with bones, and this has been utterly terrifying to her. This is, this is again one of those scenes where we're first exposed to the body parts as furniture, and this causes her to be utterly, utterly terrified. And as she's running out of the room, she runs into Leatherface, who is, a much stronger and bigger guy, and she's been running away. And she's almost gotten out of the house when this moment happens and Leatherface grabs her. And I'll show you the rest of this clip to let it kind of unfold. Okay, well, watching this scene, we've seen this horrible thing happen to Pam. She's been impaled onto the meat hook. And in the process, the director is again asking us to comment on, you know, uh, the treatment of animals in slaughterhouses, because literally this is a human being being turned into a piece of meat. And at this moment, Leatherface has turned on the chainsaw, and so we become convinced that he's going to start dismembering Pam, but instead uh, while she's hanging from the hook, he decides to dismember Kirk, whom he's already killed, and she just has to sit there and watch this horrible, horrible event. This idea of the human as a piece of meat is something that the slasher movies and the horror movies are really kind of putting into our face. And again, speaking to that larger issue you've been talking about all semester, the anxiety of being human. This is kind of a sense that we feel like we're becoming dehumanized. We're being replaced by technologies, as I was discussing with the hitchhiker, or that in fact we are just disposable entities, and the horror film really puts that on display. This scene also allows me to kind of speak to another element of the slasher that we need to keep in the back of our mind. And if you'll recall, over the course of this movie, the male characters, whether it be Kirk, who is, bludgeoned, killed very quickly, we have Jerry killed pretty quickly as well by Leatherface. It is this really drawn out thing. And in a scene I'll show you in the not too distant future, Franklin is killed very quickly while in the wheelchair. And this, the Leatherface tape puts a chainsaw right through him. And it's, all of their pain is very quick. It doesn't get kind of put forward into elaborate scenes. Whereas the women are really forced to endure incredible violence on their bodies. And this kind of raises a central issue of the horror slasher, an element of it, and the residual misogyny that we see at work in a lot of the horror movies. And in particular, as an element of the slasher, the misogyny that we see in slashers, where violence is done to women, and this violence in women's bodies are put on display. And this we see both with Sally, who we will be watched, she'll be attacked and held, forced to sit through a dinner scene that we're just not sure what is going to happen. And interestingly enough, we assume they're going to do some kind of horrible, horrible thing to her, but instead they're really just interested in eating her and letting Grandpa eat her, whether it be that disturbing scene, which we'll see in just a few minutes, where they have her, they cut Sally's finger, and we realize that Grandpa is not a desiccated corpse, but seemingly alive, as he literally is drinking blood from Sally in order to stay alive. Or obviously, as we've already talked about, Pam, the sheer fact that her body is impaled onto a meat hook and she is literally rendered into meat and forced to endure this terrible pain. She grabs, as you notice, she grabs the hook to try and lessen the pain, and then she is forced to endure the dismemberment of her beloved. And so this is again showing the double standard between men and women in the horror films and in the slashers, and reiterating yet again an element of misogyny in the slasher movie. Okay, we'll next move to another scene. I'll catch up with you in just a second. We've just gone and seen the death of Pam, and now we've, between this time period and the other, Jerry has gone looking for Pam and Kirk. He's walked into the house as well. Again, not a smart idea. And in the process, heard a noise coming from a freezer, and he opens it up, and there is Pam, who we thought was, perhaps dead and had been dismembered, but she is still there being kept on ice. And she reaches out to kind of, in a startle, we have a typical startle effect example there. And then we have Leatherface kill Jerry pretty summarily. Next, after this scene, we shift back to Franklin and Sally, and we have a long kind of heart-to-heart, and Franklin basically says, "You didn't really want me to come," and Sally says, "No, I did," but she's not really very genuine. And they are going now to the house for look for all these friends. And then we come upon this scene that I will just let unfold. I'll talk to you on the other side.
Stop!
Okay, so this somewhat interminable scene, is, I would suggest, absolutely horrifying and terrifying. I mean, it really does, use that idea of trying to scare the audience, terrorize the audience, by the sheer fact that we can't see what's really going on. I mean, it's dark for most of this scene, and the director made the choice of ensuring that she had some white, the pants and part of her shirt, so that that's how we could really see her. And I just ask you to kind of envision yourself in the position that Sally's in, of being in the dark, in a place that you don't know, and having somebody wielding a, a chainsaw, a very violent power tool, coming after you. And so the screams that Sally, like, one of the things I would suggest is the actress who plays Sally is really a really adept at using screams very effectively, because the screams work in this scene. It also, again, that's because we have the power tool. It's again a technological element coming out to do harm to the people. And so everywhere Tally turns, you just have, this entire scene is gripped by sound. So we have her screams and we have the power tool, and they are kind of the overarching constant throughout it. Runs into the house. She thinks she's going to be safe when she shuts and locks the door. But because of the power tool, because of the saw, he's able to break down the door. She runs up the stairs thinking that this will be safe, and then she sees what she thinks are people that could help her. And one of them's a corpse, and the other one we'll learn about is Grandpa. And so this terror of being kind of stuck in this bizarro space means that she has no place to turn. And then she does seem to get away, by getting, throwing herself out of the second story window. This is her way to safety. Um, is and setting up this fairly common motif that you see in lots of horror films, where people have to throw themselves out of the seemingly safe space in order to become safe. um, she's able to get away and get to the gas station, and we see the cook again, and we think that maybe this is going to be a point where she'll be safe, because we don't know yet that he is in fact Leatherface's brother. And so this is a lull, and then he ties her up, and we go all through this again, and eventually we're back at the we're at the scene with the dinner table. But again, this scene, the absolute darkness, the role of technology, and the fact that the Leatherface is simultaneously hidden by his mask and by the dark, and yet he seems to be, and following the kind of motif of the serial killer, a killing machine. He has this, she's able to hide in the shrubs and the overgrown brush, and because he has a chainsaw, he's able to cut through it all, and is seemingly unstoppable, a killing machine. And that then leads her to become more and more desperate. And again, so the sound of the chainsaw, and her screams. These really kind of set up the scene in a very effective way. We'll next move to the scene where we have right before the dinner party where Grandpa is brought to life, and then we will see the clip with the ending, and that will be our discussion. I'll meet you in just a few seconds. Okay, so Sally has been brought to the house again, a place that she wanted to escape. She's, seen all the furniture made of human beings, and now she's exposed to Grandpa again. And when she saw Grandpa beforehand, when she was running in the chase scene, she just thought he was a desiccated corpse. And then we have this scene. So let's watch this, and then we'll talk. Come back and discuss it. Okay, so here we are, having seen this really terrifying scene where Grandpa has seemingly come to life by sucking the life out of Sally by basically sucking her blood. And again, this is getting back to something we talked about a few weeks ago about the role of body fluids as simultaneously this thing of that keeps us alive, something we don't like to think about, and then obviously this is being eroticized. This is the closest we get to a kind of real perverse erotic moment in the movie. But instead of kind of emphasizing the perversity of it, what Hooper does is instead emphasize the terror and the focus on Sally's face. She has no idea, really cannot understand what she's experiencing in this scene. And this, the close-ups on the eyes and her face causes her ultimately to pass out by the sheer terror of the experience. And again, this is an element of the slasher, terrorizing the audience by putting them through an experience that they hopefully will never have to endure themselves. And Sally's then brought to the dinner table. She passes out, she awakens. Going back to where we started today, we have the scene where the family members are all there. And I don't have a good clip of this, so unfortunately I can't show this to you, but they're all sitting there. The brothers all bicker with each other. Leatherface doesn't really speak, but in this scene, he's wearing an apron. And so a lot of people have made a comment on how in this family, despite the fact that Leatherface has been this kind of literally the phallic guy with the chainsaw, that's a none too subtle phallic representation, dismembering people wherever he goes. In relationship to the cook and the hitchhiker, he is feminized, and so here he is waiting on them with a with an apron. And this this is a great example of something we were talking about, with the audience discussion from Judith Butler about how gender is performed and how it's very situational. And even within the movie itself, there's a moment where Leatherface goes from being the phallic representation of the chainsaw to utterly feminized within this dysfunctional Sawyer family structure. She's there. We experience, the scene. We're just not sure what's going to happen, and then they decide to let, and it's an almost comical scene where they decide to let Grandpa, because he used to be the best killer, kill her, and they give him a hammer, but he's too weak to even use it, and to do it, it just keeps falling out of his hands because he's so old and weak, and so this then leads her to be able to get away, and she's she runs out of the house, she's able to get out of the house, and we come to this ending, all right, because it's a uh, after all this, we finally have come to the close of what we hope is her freedom, but we're not entirely sure. Okay, so she's able to get away with the help of a truck driver, and that kind of ludicrous scene. But we've seen how much violence is done to her because the hitchhiker, as he's trailing after her, is just stabbing her repeatedly. And at the moment the hitchhiker is run over by the truck, you see the kind of look of joy on her face. So here, the one who has been hunted is seemingly deriving pleasure from this violence and horrific elements that has been actually she's been subjected to beforehand. So it's kind of an interesting comment on human beings. um, Leatherface, when he is running, is hit by uh, the big wrench, and in the process knocks, his chainsaw cuts his own leg, and that's where his leg is cut is a fairly major, where a pretty major artery is, so we're not sure what's going to happen to him at the end of this. But here he is with her, she is able to get away in a pickup truck, but you can see that she is, for all of intents and purposes, even though she doesn't exhibit it, she is a final girl insofar as she survives the movie. But she hasn't really had to do anything through her intelligence or anything to get to this point. So it's just this doesn't really fit the typical, categorization of the final girl that Carol Clover is discussing, but she is a final girl, and so far as she's the only one that survives. So that is yet, as we recall, another element of the slasher. The only question we have to ask ourselves is if she in any condition. She may have survived, but her mind seems to be utterly gone. And the movie ends with Leatherface just sitting there, with his chainsaw in the middle of the road. I'll let you watch the last few seconds. Okay, so there is Leatherface, raging. He's lost the woman, but he's sitting there with his chainsaw and raging against, just cutting into the thin air. So this is where the Texas Chainsaw Massacre ends, and we have to ask ourselves what conditions Sally will be in. So we've gone through over the course of this a few ideas to kind of summarize. We've really pointed out a lot of the elements of the slasher. We've talked about misogyny. We've talked about the final girl. We've talked about how it terrorizes the audience, how it puts us in the point of view of the killer in several different instances, and also putting us in the position of the victim. And so we've had all these kind of elements being put forward. We've also seen how Tobe Hooper has tried to, from the audience chapter, really tried to create a connection between reality and fiction, or blur that boundary with the discussion of the suggestion that this is based on real life events, the narrative of Ed Gein being out there, and the fact that Tobe Hooper was getting many of the kind of the motivations for this from the horrors of the Vietnam War. So the whole idea of life and art collapses at various points in the audience chapter. That's something that Hutchings is trying to talk about, and Hooper really does put that on display. And this is all before we even mention the beginning of the audience chapter, to refresh your memory, which began with somebody potentially bringing a chainsaw into a movie theater, which could never be proven to be a true story or not, but does show the breakdown between the movie and life itself. A few things to think about moving forward is the function of sound. All right, our next chapter from Hutchings is on the sound in the horror film, and two things that we started talking about is the role of the chainsaw, or the technology, as this kind of very powerful sound. You could think of the camera as another example, the sound of the camera throughout the movie. These are ways in which sound conveys another level of horror. The chainsaw, quite obvious, and Sally's screams. We didn't have a chance to see in the clips the scene that really focuses on Sally's face and looks close up into her eyes. This is a great example of how an extreme close up really conveys the full horror of the reality, and which we're supposed to identify with. I also just remind you that during that scene, her screams are particularly loud, and Sally is if you were to actually not be able to see anything, which we almost couldn't given the poor quality of the clip that I had, the sheer fact of the sound alone conveys a tremendous amount of horror and really takes the viewer on a ride, a truly terrifying ride. So this is the end of our video. We'll be focusing on 28 Days Later in class, and we'll be looking at the sound of horror and discussing editing with that movie. So I will see you Friday, and please make sure to watch this before then. Thanks very much.